Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is about feminism. It has two major components. The first of which is Roots and Evolution of Feminist IR Theory, which is tied to the slides that I have prepared. You can find them on Canvas. Secondly, there's a case study, Proliferation and Arms Races. This should be familiar to people because it is the thread through the presentations that I have created videos for this quarter. It has specifically, you'll see here on the screen, there are 4 subtopics. Scope of women's participation in security and conflict has been at the margins. Secondly, when it comes to protesting nuclear weapons and energy, we see women participating in, I'm going to talk about some of the organizations. And there really is a broader movement there that these organizations are situated within. All right. Thirdly, feminist security theory focuses on, I'm going to talk a bit about that, some work, and then lastly, scholars invoke a concept of peace as a goal. So, roots and evolution of feminist IR theory. Gender matters and is the primary focus, that is a unit of analysis. So there's 2 points here. Important to differentiate between gender, social construction of what is meant by masculine and feminine, and sex, the biological differences. And the way I like to characterize this in terms of thinking about the social sciences versus the hard sciences. And specifically in the social sciences, like let's say political science and sociology, we're very interested in gender. And we think about gender as like a social construct in that what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine is very much a product of a variety of factors. That includes it's like cultural norms, like certain behaviors. People have these ideas become normative, meaning that a bunch of other people accept those ideas and then behave accordingly in response. And then it transcends time. Okay. So as it transcends time, people are accustomed to thinking about, well, this is what it means to be a man, or this is what it means to be a woman in terms of in like a social context, right? Social sciences are very interested in that. And I think about political science and some of the work that I've read, like women who serve in office and the experiences that they have and how that differs from men who serve in office, right? Whether you're elected or appointed or something. However you get there. Maybe you're just hired and go through a normal hiring process. Now, when we talk about sex, we're talking about biological differences, which means we're talking about like a biology class. Or even if we were to talk about anatomy and physiology, for example. In other words, what makes a man different from a woman in terms of the way our bodies are constructed, like physically, right? So that's important to at least acknowledge the difference here. And I've brought this up and I've been talking about it for years because I think it's really important to distinguish between gender and sex. Now, we generally use these terms interchangeably. As a professional, as a trained social scientist, I don't think we should be using them interchangeably. I think we ought to be very specific about what we're using and when and why, for that matter. Categorizing individuals into 2 groups based on the perceived physical form, what it means to be male or what it means to be a female. All right. Individuals are socialized from an early age to form opinions. Yes, we learn from our family, from our peer group. We learn in school. We learn from a variety of different people, and we take in different ideas from these different people. And it's important. Those ideas are going to inform the way we look at the world. In other words, it helps us shape the opinions that we have or hold, however you'd like to phrase it. Traditionally, and I say traditionally here, masculinity is associated with power, autonomy, and being aggressive. Now, I want to say this. We say traditionally. I'm not suggesting that it should be this way or that it has to always be this way, and I'll explain more in a moment. Femininity denotes weakness, sensitivity, passivity, and this like nurturing behavior. Now, when we say traditionally, that's what it has been in the past or it has been historically. Will it always be that way? No, I think we've been going through periods where we change. What it means to be a man or a woman in the United States has changed since my parents were children, okay? And certainly over the generations. And I can definitely see differences between my parents' generation because they're baby boomers. I'm Gen X. And then, we have millennials and so forth. So the point is, attitudes change over time within a culture. And the United States is unique because we have multiple cultures within our country, which means there are different norms for different groups of people, right? So that's important. It has to be acknowledged. I want to say, though, they do change over time because attitudes change. And if attitudes change, then people's behavior is most likely going to change as well. So it will correspond. And when I say traditionally, I also want to be very clear here. I'm not suggesting that I support that or agree with that. I accept the fact as a trained social scientist, I accept the fact that attitudes change over time and therefore behavior changes over time. And when we talk about it, I think it's important to say this too, because I talk about this a lot in history classes. When we talk about topics, we're merely acknowledging what is or what has been. We're not suggesting that one or another is good, bad, right, wrong, or indifferent. And as you know from people who've taken my courses before, I don't ever decide for anyone else. It's up to you to figure out what your opinions are as an adult. There we go. Characteristics vary from place to place and time to time. Exactly. That's what I was getting at. Probably getting a little ahead of myself here, but that is a point. And it's important to note that cultural norms are one way in the United States, and they're going to be different in the Middle East or different in Southeast Asia and so forth. Meaning is important only to the extent that they relate to each other. Right. Moving on to this next slide, study of IR characterized by patriarchy that is inherent in the international system, resulting in masculine privilege. In other words, men have dominated in the past. They've been in control of various institutions or organizations, whether they're inside of government or outside of government, they've been in control. And when they're in control, that means they're making the decisions. And the decisions historically have not reflected the interests of women. And that's still the case in some parts of the world. And you know, it's not as if, I want to be very clear here, it's not as if here in the United States we don't have a distance to go ourselves. Because if you've been paying attention to the news in recent years, we had the Me Too movement, for example, taking on the issue of sexual harassment and more. And you know, I'm thinking back to going to college, we were talking about sexual assault, and that's tied into the differences between men and women and who perceives what and acts in which way in a specific situation, and what kind of behavior is acceptable and not acceptable, and what has been socially acceptable in the past is no longer socially acceptable today, which means attitudes have evolved, right? But very much, even the United States has had an issue with masculine privilege. It's changed, and I still think we have a distance to go from what I've read about and what I know. Gender is about power, and gender relations influence policy outcomes. Exactly, because there is this power differential. And if there's a power differential, the people who have more power are going to have more say in the process in comparison to the people who have less power as they relate to that process. And by process, I mean, in our case, in our country, the democratic process. In other countries, we have a lot of other westernized democratic institutions around the world, but even in those other countries, their institutions are not exactly the same as ours, right? I mean, for example, the United States has a two-party system, and in places in Europe, they have more than two parties that can actually win seats, like in England, and we're talking about Great Britain in Parliament, for example. So, system is characterized by anarchy that is male-dominated. And lastly, discipline is rife with dualisms that serve to perpetuate gender inequality. They strive for equality in all areas of life by eliminating gender discrimination. That's obviously part of the goal here. And I think part of that is also uplifting the study of gender, and specifically feminism as it relates, in political science in general and in international relations in particular, which is a subfield that you can study in this discipline. Hence the fact that we have a class. International system is ranked in a gendered fashion, meaning that there's a gender hierarchy. And remember, hierarchies, we think in terms of a triangle. As you go up the triangle, the people who are higher up the triangle typically have more power and control and more influence over others. If you're toward the bottom of the pyramid, you have less power, control, and influence. And as you go up the pyramid, there are fewer and fewer people at the different levels. And hierarchy is very much a part of the human condition, and not just this issue, but in many places. Even the college is a hierarchy, right? We have a president and a vice president, we have deans, we have professors, we have support staff, and all this. So the point I'm trying to make is there are hierarchies everywhere, but the question is, where are you in the hierarchy, and how much power, control, influence do you have? Until recently, most actors have been men. Yes, that's true. Not only in government, but also in the private sector. We talk about private companies. Issues traditionally championed by women deemed irrelevant, like education and childcare. And this is part of the problem we talk about politics, that when women have a specific interest, it can essentially be relegated to a place where people don't discuss it. I mean, they're dismissive and they say, no, we're not interested in focusing on that. That's not going to make it on the agenda. And if men are in control, the issues that are more relevant to women's lives have less of a likelihood of ending up on the agenda to be discussed. And if you're not on the agenda, then how can you ever change policy as it relates? And by that, I mean the laws, for example. That's a major form of policy making. The laws that are enacted, whether they be an ordinance at your city council level or a formal state statute at your state assembly level or general assembly level, and then the U.S. Congress, part of the federal code. So think about this for a second, right? If you're not taken seriously, then your concerns will not end up on the agenda. If they're not on the agenda, then they cannot be discussed and they cannot have any policies enacted to address them. That's important to mention here. Okay, goal is not simply add women, but rather expose field as one that always was gendered. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Always was gendered, and I think that that's important to mention here because we need to talk about the role of women and the voices that they have in the discipline of political science, and that will then, of course, cascade into international relations. View the international system as conflictual with the inherent masculine bias. Traditionally, in practice, men make decisions to go to war, and in the discipline, men have focused on the study of war, primarily from the state and the system perspective. And that's where feminism is going to be different because it's going to be tied to the experience of women in particular, right? So it's not about the system, it's about the woman, her experience. Positivist theories not only ignore the devastating effect of conflict on women and other marginalized populations, but also fail to recognize women's level of agency during conflict, such as their contributions are either ignored or undervalued. And I think this comes back to the point I was making earlier when we talk about hierarchies, not just as it relates to an international system or within a country, but also just hierarchies in society, outside of those formal governing institutions. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift gears. I want to talk about the case study, proliferation and arms races. There's two elements I want to talk about. Participants in the anti-war, disarmament, and nuclear proliferation movements and their method of participation. That's one major element. The other is going to be gendered nature of nuclear weapons. So, scope of women's participation in security and conflict has historically been at the margins. When we say at the margins, it means it's not an immediate part of the existing conversation. It's pushed to the side. It pushed so far to the side that some people would perceive it's like to the edge of irrelevance or into irrelevance. Due to labor shortages in World War II, women moved to the assembly line. And this is something I talk a lot about in United States history. There was great need for women to go into the factories to support the war effort, and women also served in the military in a limited capacity, of course. But that is relevant here. It needs to be talked about. So women are going into the workforce, specifically these factories, to help us the Allied effort in World War II. And, of course, eventually the war comes to an end. And when it does, there's this expectation that women will return to the roles that they previously held, such as that of a homemaker. Now, it's also worth noting here that women had worked in places like factories long before World War II. But what's interesting is you think about this idea of a woman getting married and then having children and then spending time raising those children. So it's the childbearing and rearing. That's culturally normative. And so those attitudes, even the women working in the factories in the 19th century, like in the Lowell mills up in Massachusetts, in those textile factories, eventually it's expected women will then get married and then be a homemaker. Well, those attitudes are going to persist into the 20th century. And so when we get to World War II, it's interesting how the circumstance dictates, and people say, well, we need you to go to work in these factories to help with the war effort. So we're going to essentially make an allowance. Even though we have these cultural norms, we're going to make this allowance because we need your help. But then when the war is over, there's this attitude of, well, we want you to return to the position that you once held. Now, of course, to me, when I think about this, once you've given people that opportunity, there's no going back. Because people typically don't want to retreat to the way that they once lived once they had that opportunity. All right, so some drifted back to the hearth. Others became part of the second wave feminism. Now, I also want to say this, too. It's important to note that social movements are usually comprised of a handful of people. They are not, even if you see these massive protests, that's a sliver of 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 the population. And there might be a lot of people out there who are sympathetic to those movements, but there's a difference between having a sympathy and actually formally joining an organization and participating in that movement's activity or that organization's activities, what they're, like they're mobilizing people to, march on Washington or to have any kind of a demonstration. There's a big difference. Most people are not going to participate in those kinds of activities. All right. In 1961, women across the United States marched in protest against nuclear weapons as well as the arms race between the United States and the former Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR. Women's strike for peace attracted primarily white, educated, middle-class women. Now, I do want to say this much. You'll notice there's an image in the background for this presentation. And if you'll note, there is an African-American woman in the center of, almost the center of the screen there. That is Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife. She actually participated, and this is an anti-nuclear demonstration outside the United Nations in 1963. She joined that work. However, some of these groups are going to be predominantly white middle-class women. And that's been one of the concerns that's been expressed about a lot of the feminist, the issues that people are concerned about and the organizations that form. In other words, do they reflect the diversity of the population? In some cases, no, they do not. They don't. All right. So in 1982, women, many born in wartime London, set up a camp near the Royal Air Force Station at Greenham Common to protest the deployment of cruise missiles. Protests against nuclear weapons continued in England throughout the following summer, culminating in over 300,000 protesting in Hyde Park, London. This is in October of 1983. So we see protests in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. We have an organization that was very influential and actually still exists, Women's International League for Peace. And the authors of the book just say for peace, but it should also be and freedom. This organization was founded in 1915. Few points I want to make here. Advancing women's rights by supporting the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So some of these groups are going to be, in many ways, they're multifaceted or like multi-issue because they're concerned not just about nuclear issues, but also they're concerned about other women's issues. The focus might be the nuclear issue, but there's going to be, women were discriminated against in a variety of different ways. And, we think about the 19th century. Women were originally involved in the abolitionist movement. And then the women's rights movement will coalesce by the mid-19th century. So women have a history of being involved in different types of organizations working on different issues. This might be nuclear, but you're not going to be just limited to nuclear because it's broader than that. Discrimination takes on many forms, and the problems that we face and the lack of women's participation within these institutions, it's all, I think, part of, how do I want to phrase this? I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase it. I'll just say it's multifaceted. It's layered. Okay, programs that continue its activism, non-proliferation, disarmament. They have the Reaching Critical Will, and they publish the Women, Weapon, and War or Women, Weapons, and War, a gender critique of multilateral instruments examining international treaties and agreements. And they looked at specifically some examples here of the Arms Trade Treaty and the resolutions from the United Nations Security Council on the matter. Report argues that the perpetuation of constructed identities serves to prevent women from participating effectively in social, economic, and political roles. All right, I'm taking some notes here, making some little notations. Also opposes nuclear energy, pointing to concerns ranging from the various stages of nuclear fuel cycle, which then involves uranium mining, enrichment, reprocessing, and the disposal of nuclear waste, to controversies regarding nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea. Now, of course, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom still exists. The Women's Strike for Peace does not. That group is now defunct. And I'm going to have information in the description section below the video that you can go and read if you're interested. You can read more about all this. When it comes to protesting nuclear weapons and energy, we see women participating in NGOs, which is a non-governmental organization, nonprofits, and women's organizations at the local, state, and national levels. Here are some examples. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Code Pink. I do remember Code Pink during the Iraq War, back in the mid-2000s. I do remember seeing Code Pink getting plenty of press attention. Of course, nuclear weapons were not an issue then. We've had concerns about terrorist organizations being able to obtain them and various countries getting access to them, but that really wasn't part of the discussion when we talked about Afghanistan and Iraq in the early to mid-2000s and the years following. Okay. Common thread: war and nuclear weapons are not only gendered, they are morally wrong. In this case, war was the focus when we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. A pragmatic approach by addressing cost, that is the price of weapons, but also the opportunity cost to programs that would improve the lives of women and other marginalized members of society. So war being gendered, and then the other point here is, if you're spending money on weapons technology, what else could you be spending it on instead? Because think about that. Whenever you're talking about budgets and deciding how you're going to appropriate or allocate money or whatever you're going to do, you have to be mindful of the fact that every dollar spent on a certain activity is not being spent on another activity. So if you're spending money on war of any kind or weapons development, you're not spending it on helping people. And I'm not arguing one way or another. Once again, that's for you to decide what you think about this matter. But I'm just bringing up the issue because it needs to be mentioned. All right. Feminist security theory agenda. We're going to move on to this one. Feminist security theory agenda focuses on the gendered nature and economics of war, as well as leaders that are primarily men. All right. Nuclear weapons extend masculine-feminine dichotomy and point to the rhetoric of political leaders as evidence. In other words, how people speak, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, how men speak, how women speak, and how leaders who want to declare war, how they speak. And there seems to be like a masculine element to that, even in my own life, right? And some of your lives too, depending on how old you are and people who are listening to this. So, certainly, when we think about aggressiveness, whenever I think about aggressiveness or aggression, I think about conflict. And that is more closely associated with male behavior. Doesn't have to be, but has been historically. All right. Postmodern feminist Carol Cohn argues that the nature of nuclear weapons is gendered. All right. When you pat the missile, or there's a phrase, pat the missile, had several meanings. It denotes affection, intimacy, and even sexual possession. So there's a sexual layer to this. Then patting is something one does to a child or pets. So there's a maternal element to this. Then we have mastering language of discourse leads to power and agency. And lastly, language also contributes to the development of culture. So you think about that. Language is intertwined. Language is very much a part of culture. And how we think and speak. And when we speak, think about this too. Discourse, how we speak, how we write about these issues. It matters because that's going to reflect, what's traditionally been masculine or feminine. And leaders oftentimes, historically, there have been more male leaders than female, at least in the United States, when it comes to our governing apparatus. How men or women speak about this matters. Feminist scholars and peace scholars invoke a concept of positive peace as a goal, rather than a negative sense, the absence of war. So positive peace as opposed to negative peace. And there's a few items I want to mention here. Argue that even in times of peace, states are constantly preparing for war because you have a standing army. I mean, think about that. We have a standing army. That is, war is not bounded by time or space. In other words, it's not a matter of you prepare when you need to, but that there's always a military in existence, and they're always training, and there's always weapons development, new technologies being created, right? And when you create these technologies, it begs the question, what are you going to do with them? It's almost like creating them with the intention of using them. But the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, they exist whether or not we're at war. And so really this is a questioning. When you think about it, it's like questioning. You have this standing army constantly. So what does that mean? And what does that mean about attitudes as it relates to, war or conflict with other nations? Do not adhere to the demands of the security dilemma like their realist counterparts, arguing that resources are better spent on improving the lives of all citizens within the state. And this goes back to the point I made a few minutes ago. If you spend money, and the Defense Department, and we spend a lot of money on that, and you can look at this. In my American government class, I have charts how much we spend on how much of the budget goes towards defense, national defense, and there's a lot of money. Believe me, there's a lot of money being spent there. So I bring this up for a reason. When you choose to spend it in that way, you're choosing not to spend it in other ways. And so the feminists here, or the scholars, and I'm sure it's not just the scholars, it's people who would self-identify as feminists who are not necessarily scholars, they're not academics, but those folks might say, well, we could be spending this money in a variety of other ways that could help the citizens of this country. And even people who aren't citizens of this country, perhaps. People who are immigrating here. All right. Women who were an integral part of the anti-nuclear movements during the second wave, or women were an integral part of the anti-nuclear movements during the second wave. And then a couple last points here. However, they're not present in the decision-making processes and at the forums central to the discussion regarding disarmament and implementation of the Non-proliferation Treaty. All right. So the question is, to what extent are women involved in this conversation and contributing to the policies that are developed or enacted? And lastly, the starting point for examining war and weapons should be women's lives. The starting point for examining war and weapons should be women's lives. This is according to feminist scholars. Okay, that's where I'm going to end this presentation. If you look in the description section below the video, there's a variety of resources that you're encouraged to go and read. Check them out if you have time. And thank you so much for listening. Peace.